Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about Teendyth on Desecrated Faith and Newfound Religion by Stephen Mark Maine. This was a book that I read on the Fresh Meat feature a couple of weeks ago, and I was intrigued by the first chapter that I read, so I went and got it, and now we're going to talk about it. However, before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The second thing is if you would like to be featured on the channel, there are two ways. The first way is through Lamoy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creative genius. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit it to the Fresh Meat feature, that first chapter will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. Obviously, I could end up getting it, but then you have to worry about what I might say because, I mean, it's frightening. It is frightening when other people start reading your work and then you're like, well, now I get to see how it worked. And then you kind of see, then you can see if some people kind of didn't see the different directions people come at your work. And sometimes it is something you could never imagine. So there's that. But good luck. The best thing that we can hope for is anybody talks about our stuff at the very least, right? The third thing is if you would like to check out any of my books, burn me any, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request. My newest novel, Body More Zero, featuring these two gentlemen over here, will be available at the end of October. I hope you enjoy it. I loved working on it. I need to finish the audiobook. I'm sorry for disappointing myself. Not being done with it like I meant to be a month ago. But with that said, let's jump into it. First, I'm going to go off and say, first things first, obviously, this is from the feature. And I read it, and when I read it, I liked the prose and was interested in the idea that it presented. So here we are. Despite how it might seem, though, I actually really but despite how it might seem with responses to things, I do actually really like religious themes in works. I like to see how they're explored, especially cults. Maybe that's not actually a surprise, but I'm also fairly specific in what I don't like to see relating to religious themes. This actually didn't break anything that had to do with religious themes that annoyed me, but the construction of the story sort of got me. And you're going to see what I mean as we go through the story and then get to my final comments. But I did love Saint Gregory, which I read last year. I'm looking forward to reading whatever that author does next with that series, because I really liked Ambrose. He was such an endearing character. But so that was kind of the hope in going into this, is seeing something neat. And in the beginning of this book, I thought it did a really good job, at least in that first chapter. One of the things that I liked is that I liked Absalom's character. He seemed interesting, he seemed good-hearted, and as we go forward, no, that's not it. So we're going to get into the synopsis and then the final comments of it all. Looking forward to your thoughts. If you would like to read this novel for yourself, it'll be in the description down below. I highly recommend checking it out if it interests you, because you may have a different experience than I did, or you may be interested in seeing situations play out for yourself. With that said, let's get into it. The novel starts off with David Absalom Teendyth I, a Dutchman in 1786, who also is the leader of a church, and he is leaving for the New World. We'll get a brief history leading through the long line of holy men in this family who lead the same church and also have the same name. It's all done in New England until we finally get to David Absalom Teendyth IV, and that will be the main character of our novel. His mother is very sickly, very weak, and she struggles to keep weight on, as well as other problems that she has, and many of her afflictions also went into Absalom, and he sort of suffered those illnesses, so he was not really seen as the strong leader that he could have been. Though people were still expecting him to follow up after his father, because it's kind of just what you do. Absalom also very much respects his father and sees him with high regard. Quote, "Those who have not been involved in the profession of pastoral duties would usually think that being a pastor just means sitting around all day thinking about how you want to tell your congregation that they are doing something wrong. They do not realize that is a privilege reserved for only the first pastors. In fact, those people are not pastors, they are preachers. The kind of man who tells you that he knows how hard you have had to have it your whole life, but has never had to give up his weekly steak, and he for sure is not going to give up the same steak for anyone who is hungry. He also says that his father gives up everything that he can to anyone who asks, and this leads to even his own family going hungry while his father is being scammed by anybody who asks for things, having those things being given to him. Because Absalom's father didn't believe in turning away empty hands. He also tried to provide as God had provided for him, even if it left his family for want. Regardless, Absalom had always respected his father and trained to follow in his footsteps. Quote, "From the time that I was 4, I would sit with my father reading the scripture until the late hours in the sanctuary. I would caravan through the streets while he modeled to me how to love and look after those who needed help. I saw the kindness in his eyes as he saw those who were struggling. I also saw the men going into the local bars immediately after my father had given them money for food. We would pass by those same men later in the day asleep in the gutter. I did not know what they were doing, but I did know that my father gave them money for food, and that was not what they were using it for." However kind his father was, there were also scammers in the community, obviously, who would take advantage of the father's kindness whenever they could. One of these people was by the name of Charles Willis and his obese family. Charles Willis was one of the main deacons of the church, and we'll see him continuously. It's important to note that one of his first offenses that we're told about is him scamming Absalom's family for money during winter, to the point that Absalom's family was kind of left very hungry, unable to put on the weight that him and his mother needed to help them survive more healthily through the winter months. The son of Charles Willis was also a sort of nemesis who would not only pick on Absalom, but wouldn't be stopped, as some of the people in the church believed that harassment could cure the frailty of Absalom. As Absalom gets older, his dad spends less time around him and his family, mostly from father serving the congregation. At least that's the excuse. We'll learn some other things later. He and his mother just accept that dad isn't around as much, even if they don't like being without him. As an adult preparing to step up after his father, the nemesis Benjamin, who is the son of Charles, is an alcoholic in the gutter, and Benjamin sees Charles running over to get his way to the church and is like, "Oh, are you going to go and see your dad? Well, it's too late. The deacons are already talking to him at the freaking church, and I am going to be the next leader of faith. Suck that." So Absalom is concerned about this and continues his way to the church, where he overhears his father in an argument with Charles Willis and the deacons. They are arguing over whether Absalom actually has the ability to take over the church, considering that he has been absent from training because of his health issues. The dad argues that it's because Absalom was sickly, so he couldn't do normal training, but he is fully prepared to take over at the church. How he can be sure of this, I'm not entirely sure. I was just going with it. I believed it at the time. This felt like a setup that I was like, I can go with this, but this will be the style of the overall story. Charles isn't having it, isn't accepting these arguments, and argues that his alcoholic son would be a better leader for the church. I don't know how you can even argue that in good faith. I don't know how he thought that was going to work on anybody. I don't know how he actually believed it, because later we're going to find out that he truly believed his alcoholic son would be better, even though his alcoholic son spends all of his days in the gutter. But okay, anyway. Absalom's dad says that Absalom will at least go to school to get ready for the training if that's what he needs to do to prove that he is ready. They've already got the school set up. His uncle works at this school, and so Absalom can get to the training to get to where he needs to be if that's what you need if you need to see formal training to see that he is ready. Absalom is mildly surprised that his dad doesn't slap the Holy Spirit into Charles for the things that Charles is saying, since Daddy had never shown this kind of restraint towards him when he was in trouble as a child. But here we are. The terms of the agreement are not accepted because Charles really wants his kid to be in the leadership position, specifically so he can collect the tithes. And so he says, us older elders, us deacons, can override you. And so then Daddy is like, well, why don't we ask the townspeople who they would like to be the leadership of the church? Because guess what? Your collecting of tithes isn't going to matter if nobody wants to be here, because Benjamin sucks a butthole. Of course, he said it in a nicer way than I just did. Though they don't like it, they do agree that is really the only way, because if the townspeople are not happy, then yeah, they're not going to get payment for anything. So fine. They agree that the next day there will be a vote and they will accept the terms of the vote. Now, during the next day, the Reverend, which is Absalom's dad, goes to the local bar to ask the barkeeper, Mr. Sterling, to make an announcement that there will be a meeting later that night at the church voting on the next leadership, and everybody needs to be there. That Mr. Sterling needs to close the bar to ensure that the max amount of people are going to be at the church. Fortunately, the barkeeper also hates the deacons, so he agrees to not only shut the bar, but to give patrons a free beer if they show up for the vote. Absalom and his dad spend the rest of the day helping people out of the gutter, the drunkards and the prostitutes, while inviting them to come to church to vote. The vote is then later taken, and everyone in the church hates the freaking deacons, and the deacons hate how the church is run, especially since Absalom actually respects women and welcomes them into the church. Likely would have been a riot had Absalom not been selected, but he is, and after he goes home, he and his father inform his mother of what's to come. She's excited to have her husband home with her again when he retires, but she's not excited to hear about her son going to study with Uncle Eli, the fundamentalist. So this is already very different from what we're going to experience later in the story. I can see possibly like areas where it was trying to then later justify things, but with who he is in the beginning here and how his wife, I'm specifically using the signs from his wife, where his wife is happy that he will be home. However, in a later case, we're going to learn that he had been cheating on her all of this time when he was out with other people, and that he thinks that she's a whore because she was raped by his brother, and that it was her fault for seducing him, and that he feels justified in cheating because she had sex with his brother, which was actually rape. So it's very weird. And the fact that it says he specifically in the text, it says he welcomes women into the church and everybody hates the deacons, but the deacons are still going to force Benjamin into that position despite everybody hating them, despite knowing that they are not going to get any tithing because everybody will stop coming. This is where the story actually starts failing for me, because when I'm looking at a story, I'm looking at the logic of how do these people operate? How are these decisions made? How did they make these decisions based on the information they have and the desires that they have to get to the thing that they want? And things can go wrong. But if they acknowledge everyone hates them, the son is an alcoholic, and they're not going to be able to get the tithes, then why would you defy this? Because you just have to wait a year for him to come back and you could still collect tithes as normal. And there is no, like you'll see as we go through, I don't see the logic in the church, and maybe you can see the logic in the church, but I don't see how this goes the way that it goes. So anyway, Uncle Eli visits the house to take Absalom off to the school. It appears that there is more than a little tension toward him with Absalom's mother. We don't know what it is yet. When she gets up to go and work on dinner, Uncle says that it's because he used to have a thing for her and made a grand gesture that sort of destroyed any relationship they could have had. Just then, Mom calls and says that dinner is ready. And so then Uncle Eli ends the story just in time to not tell Absalom what happened, and then to say it's a story for another time. So it didn't even need to come up because he only mentioned it immediately to cut it off. Personally, I think that it was a poor choice because the reader really didn't need an explanation at this time for the mother's coldness, and we could have lived until it would have come out naturally what had happened. Bringing it up now within a couple of lines and then saying it doesn't matter is just a way for this novel to try to force it into making a mystery for tension. But it really just read as pointless for me. I'm the type of reader who doesn't need everything explained immediately, and the way that this happens in this book, it made it feel like it was forced to explain the mother's coldness without telling you exactly what it was, but just that there was something there. Either way, it felt like the author's hand directly getting involved for me, and that pulls me out of a story. The family then sits for food, sleeps through the night, barely because they're all a little antsy, and the next morning, Mom is being super attentive to Uncle, but theoretically only because she wants to make sure that he doesn't come back. Now, that's obviously not going to happen because he's going off with the child, so I don't know where that thought comes from. You would think that there'd be maybe some discussion with Dad, with Eli, with Absalom as to like what the expectations are when he comes back, if it is to avoid seeing Eli again, but it's just like, for some reason, she thinks he's taking him and then won't bring him back. The family goes together to the train station to see the boy and his uncle off, and Mom is sad and already missing her son, and Dad is over here openly flirting with Mom now to the point that it is shocking and out of character to Absalom. And here we get more of the parents involving their son in a sex life by asking if he wants a brother or a sister while they're flirting and going on, which again makes it make less sense later when Dad is so vile to his wife, because this didn't need to happen. It just gave a false impression. And maybe it was the author trying to make it a red herring, but it it didn't read like organic behavior to me that like works through the story. Finally, they board, and at some point, Uncle tells Absalom that they are boarded on the wrong car because he was too distracted from all of the talking that they were doing. I'm pretty sure at this point he was lying, and they just jump from car to car doing dangerous moves and then slip into a little private cart. Absalom is thinking twice about all of this happening, but doesn't believe that he should defy his uncle, so he just follows along with what his uncle wants from him. When they get into the high society private car booth, Uncle shows Absalom an exceptionally beautiful sacrificial knife called a kukri. And obviously this is something that is going to matter in the future. The uncle says that it's so abnormally beautiful because it is meant for sacrifice. And this is when the uncle informs Absalom about Hinduism and this new religion that new religions are made all the time, referring to Joseph Smith more recently. He says that Hinduism isn't new, but just sects of it that are practicing with the knives like this has now died out, and that new sect, just that sect that had been using this knife recently, had died out, and that new sects are being born all the time. The uncle then details a story about how he got the knife in Asia while visiting a village. Quote, "Okay, you've been forewarned. The village was quiet when we entered. There wasn't even any activity toward the village center. No noises came from the houses. Children's toys lined up the streets. There was absolutely no one. It unnerved us as to how we traveled to his brother's house. We could rest there and ask any questions that we had about the stillness, but there was nothing on the way to his house. Any sign of children was just abandoned toys. We were surprised when we knocked on the door and his brother answered. It was a strange sight to see such a large man in such a state of panic. You see, Andovit's brother was very large, but not one bit overweight. His profession had caused his muscles to tone to the point that they ripped down his arms. His dark skin glistened with sweat in such profound levels that it could only be explained by anxiety. Even the Indian heat couldn't explain such profuse amounts of perspiration the man was covered in. His head was clean-shaven, and his beard was kept close to the jaw. That way, he had no risk of harming himself during work days to stray hairs. He rushed us inside, adamant that we've not sat outdoors for too long. Bishmal, that was Anvit's brother, refused to tell us anything about what happened. Whenever we asked about it, he would just insist that we went to sleep. I'll tell you in the morning. You need to rest, he repeated over and over. We finally gave in to this request and laid down on the floor to sleep. It was short-lived, though, as I almost immediately heard scuffles, followed by someone sprinting out the door. Bishanapple had knocked his brother unconscious and was sprinting out of the house. I shook off my sleep and followed in pursuit as quickly as I could. Bishanpal was both fast and strong from years of working in a forge. In contrast, Anvit was rather small from years of poverty due to an injury that it had taken long for Ishampal to create distance between the two of us. I didn't make it. Never mind that. No, I didn't catch him. I chased him through the village for a good 5 minutes until he stopped. When he did stop, it was too late. I froze when I saw her surroundings. There were piles of bodies, Ab. Men, women, and children, the elderly, livestock, all were piled up and streams of blood flowing from underneath the piles. He had extinguished all of them. Even the crops from the village were piled up, all charred to a crisp in some sort of burnt offering. As soon as I saw Bishanpal, it was already too late. He threw Anvit on top of one of the piles and unsheathed the knife he had tied to the sash of his waist. He brought the blade down hard on Anvit's skull. He slashed right through the top of his skull, exposing a murky mist of blood and brain, and I saw him spasm several times before he laid still. I looked back up, and before I could even think to plead for my life, the beast of a man turned and said, I saw him. He took the knife in his hand, still covered in Anvit's gray matter, and slit his own throat, throwing himself onto the pile as a gurgle of his last breaths. He then took the knife from that body and then left the mission early. Why would you do that? Especially as a religious man, unless you wanted evil to befall you? I don't know, but then you have to wonder, like, how has this knife not affected Uncle Eli all the time that he's had it? If you want to assume that the knife influences Absalom later, because it should have influenced Uncle Eli at some point. The uncle then gives Absalom the knife, which in my opinion looks like the uncle is damning Absalom. If it's not like, oh, I want to get rid of you because you're the spawn of the woman that I loved who didn't love me back, then it's trying to pass like the evil onto this kid, but you then have to assume that bad things have been happening to Eli, but I don't think we see any proof that anything bad was happening to Eli. It's like Eli is a servant of the knife. But we don't really get any further, as far as I can recall, we don't get any further lore on the knife of what the knife is serving, or if Eli serves the knife. I guess it's the putrid cloud. But like, what is that? Immediately after receiving the knife, Absalom is fixated on it. It is a black blade. He listens to more of his uncle's stories until they reach their destination, and then he is urged to take a nap once they get out of the train car and get into their other form of transportation that'll take them the rest of the way to the school. He is then having a bad dream, hearing a woman call out to him before he wakes up, and he goes to survey the school and the dorms, find his room, and notices how much dust and disgust there is on everything. Why it's all dusty and disgusting, I don't really know. That doesn't really come into the story at all, but it spends a lot of time telling you how decrepit this place is. During this, he also meets his roommate, a ginger-haired boy named James. James is concerned about Absalom's health because he is struggling to breathe, and it is very obvious. After a bit of jeering, they do become friends instead of judgmental, like, aggressive roommates. And though James wants to help Absalom with his luggage and moving in, Absalom is both suspicious and guilty feeling because he doesn't want to be somebody else's responsibility. He's not used to other people's kindness, and he doesn't want to take advantage of James. Now, you would think even with a bunch of bad people, a couple of bad people in his hometown who would take advantage of his dad and his family, you would think that there would still be good people in his hometown that would appreciate the Reverend because they chose the Reverend and Absalom's family over the deacons, so not everybody can be bad. But you never really get a sense of the township that Absalom and his family is from. You only hear about the drunks and the prostitutes and the bartender, and nothing about how everyone else is, or if people in the community at least appreciate Absalom's family. James helps him move everything upstairs, and it makes him feel a little bit emasculated, but he's still grateful. He worries about the reliability of the bed that he's supposed to lay on because it's questionable at best. And as he lays there in bed at night, he thinks about how difficult things might look in the dark, he thinks about how different things look in the dark, and it feels like there is a monster watching him. When they wake up the next morning, they go to class, and he is warned about Mr. Quill, who is very strict, and how you don't want to get on his bad side. A kid in class isn't paying attention, and this gets Mr. Quill's attention on him, disciplining everybody in the room and saying that if anybody makes a noise, and saying that no one is allowed to make a noise, and if you make a noise for the rest of the class, then you are not allowed to make any noise or talk to anybody when you are out of class for at least a week. This is supposed to help teach them how silence is needed to listen to the needs of your community, but it also is in a twisted way doesn't really work because the teacher says to be silent to listen to needs while not listening to the needs of others. Later, they go to class that compares world religions, which is taught by Absalom's uncle. It's also kind of a weird thing to be sent to a religious school that is meant to teach the disciplines of that religion, of that theology, and then get comparative religious classes there, because that doesn't feel like it would really fit, especially when we're talking about the mid-1800s. Theoretically, this is meant to strengthen their faith by exposing them to others' beliefs, and the class is skipped through, though it says that Eli is on top of the information about other religions, unlike other theologians, and James, the roommate, is mad that Absalom didn't say that he was related to Eli, since Eli's kind of a celebrity on campus because he's such a cool teacher. The rest of the day goes by without anything of note happening. At bedtime, he's getting freaked out by the feelings of a creature being there, so he gets out his knife that his uncle gave him. He can't sleep well, and James is saying his uncle's name in his sleep, which is also I'm not entirely sure what the order of events are in this anymore, because you've also got, obviously he's saying, why didn't you tell me that you were related to Eli? And then saying Eli's name in sleep, and then we'll later learn that Eli raped him. But did Eli rape him after Absalom was there or before that? Because this feels like the beginning of the semester or training. It doesn't really lay out the time very well. At least when I was reading it, I didn't get a good sense of time passage or relationships or anything. At this point in the story, we're at 32%, and my question was, what is the driving force of this story for the students in that moment? We know that he needs to accomplish passing his classes here so that he can take over after his father and make sure that his nemesis doesn't, because that's a bad man. We know that he has this cursed sacrificial dagger, and we know that he has started seeing things since getting it. So far, though, I think the tension is a bit light for what this is. and it could have been a lot harsher with all of the mysteries and this feeling of dark academia that was in the story that never actually let itself take over. The story also lacked motivation and the tension of the character needing to accomplish something and something kind of being spooky around it. Like, you don't always have to have something working against the character, but because if you're trying to build the relationships, because that's going to be a point of contention later, then you need to have the other things that are a threat, and that would be the looming creature that this is sort of alluding to, but it didn't really let seep into the story. The lightness of the tension as well as the descriptions combined with the school setting are what made this feel very young. It actually felt like a YA novel. Even though I never read Harry Potter, I was still getting Harry Potter vibes, and I was still seeing vibes for like Snape versus whoever being similar to Quill and Eli, because there were some vibes contentions between Quill and Eli, and there was also a bit of an attempt to make Quill look really bad, but then Eli was actually the bad guy, but then Quill was also not a great guy, and so I don't know if it really determined what it wanted to do. James and Absalom are quickly becoming close. James is pulling Absalom into doing a bunch of pranks and being kind of a crazy boy with some antics, and they grow closer together as Absalom becomes more free-spirited and is becoming more risky and is actually improving in his health by getting out more. He also hasn't seen that weirdo creature from his dreams for a while, but feels its presence around him. This feeling grows with Absalom becoming paranoid and getting away from people, and he appreciates James didn't treat him any different when he started acting different. Quote, "But even in that light, I felt those eyes looking at me through the dark of our windows, and I felt the presence of something covetous peering through the cracks of the damned cafeteria. No matter what it was, I could not escape its gaze. For some reason or another, it wanted me. James made me forget about the things that craved me in the dark, even as others began to notice my growing paranoia and distance themselves from my person. He still continued to act as my brother, despite my concerning behavior. Even as I shut myself away from the outside, he continued to stay by my side. With him, I could ignore the thing that was watching me and enjoy our time together." Somehow, Mr. Quill never punishes them for all of the things that they're doing, even when he mentions that they have done pranks that obviously implicated them as being problem children, until finally they push it just a little bit too far. But considering our first introduction to Mr. Quill, I don't really understand how they can get away with everything they get away with until it gets pushed too far, because he was so quick to punish everybody for that one kid not paying attention in school at the first time. The culmination of everything going on turns into James falling asleep in class and Absalom trying to wake him up, which gets Quill's attention. Quill punishes Absalom by telling him that he is going to have to spend the night in the cafeteria alone with no lights, knowing that Absalom is afraid of the dark. I'm not sure why we needed this to happen for him to get in trouble when we could have had him get in trouble for the number of pranks that he had been doing with James. Quill should have just caught them in doing those pranks or punished them in doing those pranks or chased those down and been like, I'm going to make an example of you, but instead we get this random thing added on top of all of those while everything else gets ignored. Well, I can understand the time skipping that is going on here in order to build the relationships. It's also not allowing us to see what we need to see, which would be the biggest implications of any of the relationships going on, of the scare, of the monster, or who the monster relates to, or how things are changing. Absalom and James meet with his uncle, as they have been doing in general, so that they can hang out, have lunch with him, tell him about the punishment. The uncle says that there is nothing that he can do to alleviate that punishment because Mr. Quill has an influential family and donates a lot of money to the school, and so there is no way to get out of him being punished, so he's just gonna have to deal with it. Again, something feels weird here in the story, and more than anything, I can't put my finger on it at the moment other than it feels undeveloped. After all of that, Eli is like, can you please go? I have other things to do. You can't hang out here with your lunch. So they leave. Absalom is then in the cafeteria looking around for a place to sleep that night and fighting off the fright when James appears. James apologizes for abandoning him because he didn't realize that he was so afraid of the dark. Once Absalom regains his composure, the boys sit down. He asks James why they're at school, and eventually James confesses that he's not there because he wants to follow his dad's footsteps, but his dad sent him there to fix him after he made eyes at the deacon's son. Absalom accepts James as he is and asks if he loves him the way that James says I love you more than anyone. Absalom says that he loves James back, just not in the same way that James loves him, and he doesn't even know what that means. Once he falls asleep, he has a dream of being in church with his family's congregation, James and a random woman. A ritual with animals goes goes off and he consumes them. Then the woman and James are dead and mangled on the ground, and he wakes up. Catching up with his uncle the next day, he learns that a letter has come from Charles Willith, the deacon, from home. He is begging for Absalom to come home because he instilled his son since Absalom was gone, and it's become a disaster, and he wishes that the kid wasn't even his son. It's so bad. While with Uncle Eli, Absalom is also informed that there was a student who died of a fire in the cafeteria. Eli dismisses it as pretty nonchalant. Stuff kind of just happens at religious school, and then he excuses himself to go to work. Absalom and James go back to their room for lunch, where they randomly are interrupted by Mr. Quill, who starts violently beating James in the hall as soon as he gets the door open. Absalom gets a burst of courage and energy to fight off Mr. Quill, and obviously he doesn't have any medical issues anymore because they're never going to come up ever again, BT dubs. They just are mentioned continuously until he gets to the school. But he beats Mr. Quill too. Paramedics take him away, and then James is left unconscious, so they take Mr. Quill away, but not James. Shortly thereafter, a boy named Peter appears at the door, and he introduces himself as James's brother. After a bit of chatter, they talk about the student who died in the shadows in the cafeteria that Absalom had been feeling around. It turns out that the story Eli had told about the student who caught fire in the cafeteria was a lie, and that Eli was there when the kid died, and the shadow stalking around everything has actually been Eli. Some of this just feels like a random happenstance as opposed to what these characters are actually doing to exist within the framework of the story, and so it feels more random as opposed to like adding to the mystery or the tension. James and Absalom are getting closer as time passes. There are no nightmares at night, and James got Absalom a birthday gift, and Absalom learns that James is from a well-off family. This makes him think about his bullies, and he wonders if his bully back home has suffered the same sort of traumas as James has, which is what turned him into what he was. Then he considers, no, that couldn't have happened at all because Benjamin was from a very privileged background, that there was no sign of the mistreatment that James has gone into going into that guy. Here, I think we see some budding of some sort of framework going on. Quote, "What James and I had in common was trauma. It seemed as if there were two different sects of people in existence, those who suffer and those who cause the suffering. James and I both belonged to those who suffered, as did my father and my mother. On the other hand, the Williths, Quill, and the like were in those of the ilk and the causing suffering. My uncle was becoming more and more debatable on where he lied. It was a clear-cut scenario, a harsh truth to have learned at such a young age as James and I did. The wicked flourished and the corrupted causes suffering. Suffering belonged to the righteous." He has another dream about becoming perverted, that is twisted, love turning into torture and all that. When he wakes up, James isn't there, so he goes asking around about it. Kind of disappointing again, because while the narrative mentions that people know about how he beat Quill, we see no response in anyone for anybody thinking of how to treat him because he has that relationship or that reputation with Quill. People aren't showing any fear or pride or gratefulness, and he's not getting into trouble. And this is what usually causes a problem for me when I'm reading. I want to see actions matter, and maybe it's something that could come up later, so I always give opportunity for that, because not everything is dealt with in the first book, but you don't really see a reaction from anybody in any of these passing moments, so then it makes me wonder if anybody will respond to anything. Like, it's mentioned, but it never happened. It's kind of like when other stories like ACOTAR talk about trauma happening to characters, but then you don't see anything related to that trauma come out of the dropping of that information. It just is kind of there as a dressing, if you know what I mean. In which case it makes you go, well, if nobody is going to respond to it, if the characters don't even show anything in response, why does it even matter? This is where I really struggle, because I keep seeing things in this that would make sense, actions to consequences, consequences to actions, but it keeps going so that earlier inaction makes no sense to just write more stuff that's inconsequential via summary before making something happen that could have made sense to happen at an earlier instance. Like being punished by Mr. Quill feels like it would have been better if it just happened when Absalom was coughing to be a punishment, making Mr. Quill look even more insanely controlling when he got punished for coughing coughing in the room after the guy said, hey, make no more sounds, and coughing would have counted, especially since, Absalom brought up, I feel a tickle in my throat, but even in that moment, I didn't cough. There are some great things in here for a character, but they don't actually feel like they are being explored, and I can't really understand why. Then you get stuff like this, quote, I decided the best course of action would be to ask our peers if they had seen him on campus. Yes, it would be a bit of a risk due to my treatment of Quill, and it went completely against my better judgment to speak to those who have come to me to see me as a monster, but my worry was quickly becoming panic. Most of my peers seemed unbothered by the treatment of our elder professor, as their receiving of me was surprisingly normal despite my outburst. A few had thanked me for the service I had done for the seminary. That's not to say all of them treated me warmly, but those who treated me coldly had done so before that day's event. So it all just feels pointless. You won't see it, and you're not actually seeing the characters interact or suffering for their actions. Of course, he's not going to care how they treat him, because it's inconsequential to whatever this book is apparently trying to do when they feel whatever way, and they feel that way. To give further example of this, he talks about how he's supposed to be further punished. He talks about how he's supposed to be further punished right now and not have free movement, yet it skips through him having free movement. No one stops him, no one reports him, there's zero tension, there's zero bother. This could have been insanely tense, but it's not, and none of the doors are locked, and he's not denied anything. It just feels like there is no risk to it. So, then what's the story about? It's not character growth going up or down. It's not really fighting something to win or lose because there is no struggle. It's just going to go exactly one way, and I guess it was broadcasted from the moment that they jumped the cars and nothing happened. Eventually, Absalom ends up at his uncle's office, and when he's discovered, he's called in, and he asks his uncle about James being missing and accuses his uncle of lying about the death of that student from the cafeteria. Absalom trusts nothing coming out of his uncle's mouth as he continues to craft things in specific ways to make Absalom see his uncle as both a stranger and a monster. To change the subject, he hands Absalom a belt and tells him to give it to James, saying that James left it behind in his office. Uncle tells Absalom to stay out of trouble. A little bit later, Absalom finds James in the cafeteria curled up in a fetal position, sobbing. Absalom comforts him for about an hour before helping him get back to their dorm room. Part of this is odd because he's just sort of there, just sort of vibing, and then there is nothing really to tell him why to go to the cafeteria to look for James. He just does. I'm assuming partially mystical and partially because that's where they spent the night, so he for some reason thought he needed to go there. When they wake up the next morning, James is going to go home with Peter, and he leaves Absalom sad and worried that he'll never see James again. They awkwardly work around each other, and James is avoiding questions. There's mention of knocking knives over and looking for it on the floor. This is the sacrificial knife that Absalom got from his uncle, and they can't find it. They eventually give up, but Absalom's like, I'll find it later. When James is ready to leave, he asks Absalom how much he means to him, and Absalom says that he loves him more than he's loved any other boy ever. James says that's good enough for him. Absalom hugs him, and it makes James pull away. When James leaves, he asks Absalom to stay here and to not see him off because goodbyes are hard. Then James continues to pack for his own leaving coming over the weekend. When Absalom goes out to leave later, he finds Peter. Peter says that James never showed up to leave, and it's been a few days. Absalom accuses Eli of doing something to him before running off to find James where he thinks he might be, which is again the cafeteria/kitchen. When he gets there, he finds James's luggage stacked outside the door, so kind of makes you wonder why nobody noticed that before. But then he goes inside and he sees James dead on the floor. The way that this scene is written was awkward to me because it was kind of obvious that it was going to be dead, but the slow narrative read like it didn't really seem to be registering, and that did feel like it was intentional of it not hitting Absalom immediately that he was dead because he didn't want to, but there was just something awkward about it. You tell me. Quote, Peter seemed relieved to have found his brother. Tears of relief curled in the corners of his eyes as he ran into the kitchen to embrace his brother. He seemed to have yelled something as he ran through the door, but for some reason I could not comprehend what it was. Peter dropped to the ground and scooped James up in his arms, the strange brown substance that covered the floor staining his trousers. A look of panic spread across his face, his lips moving in a frantic scream that produced no noise. I heard none of the thudding that had accompanied this feeling in the past. "Are you all right, Peter? I cannot seem to understand what you are saying." He continued to yell in a soundless voice as his face became more and more frantic. I did not see why he was worried. Chances are James had fallen asleep on the kitchen and did not awake in time to meet Peter to leave. It would not have been out of character for him to do as such, and it was not unlike him to sleep as heavily as he was now. There really was no reason for Peter to respond as poorly as he had been. What truly was peculiar, though, was the strange stain that covered the floor. It had not been here the night before. Its vastness would have made it impossible to miss. I bent down to investigate it further. It was slightly tacky, dry in most spots, save where the substance had been at the thickest. Even strange was its scent. It was both metallic and sweet simultaneously. It was blood. Now, it does appear to be a slow dawning on him. Something about it read weird to me. Once Peter runs away to go and get help, Absalom investigates the body. James apparently slit his wrist and tried to cauterize him. He also finds his missing obsidian knife and a letter addressed to him. Quote, "Dear Absalom, I expect you to be the one to find this letter. If not, I assume that it'll somehow reach you eventually. Firstly, I am sorry for hurting you this way. I know that it is cruel of me to leave you in such a violent manner, and even crueler to do so with something so dear to you. But I had to make this decision. In my life, I have only truly loved one person the way that I have loved you. I know that you will never love me the same way, but knowing you at least loved me as a brother was enough to me. There was one man that I thought of as my mentor, and that was your uncle, Eli Teendyth, who was a brilliant man. I admired and looked up to him, even loved him for that. To me, he was just a more wizened version of you. He reminded me so deeply of you in almost everything, appearance, mannerisms, voice. I see him now in everything that you do, and it is torturing me. You are a beautiful person, but I see the vileness of your uncle in you, and I cannot handle it. It scares me to think that you will turn out just like him when you are older. Eli Teendyth is a vile, disgusting man, and I only wish that he had been in this damned cafeteria when the last victim set it alight. If he had been, I would not be here, doing the same thing as that poor wretch, and that is why I can no longer bear living. I love you, Absalom, even in death. Goodbye." For this to have packed a punch, I still believe it needed more time to develop the relationship naturally. We didn't really see it coming, and we didn't really get to see that relationship build to make this have meaning. So it feels like the punctuation to what the story is trying to do, or something the story is trying to do in earnest. Specifically, what I think this story needed was to extend the exploration and development of the growing relationship with James and the change present in Absalom by virtue of being near Eli and that knife. However, I don't feel like this book has made Absalom look like he's wicked like his uncle. He was doing pranks alongside James at James's encouragement, and he was battling with his uncle and calling him a bad person and a monster. So I'm not really sure what the letter is getting at when it says it can see the same evil in Absalom. Now, I know that later we're going to see Absalom start doing bad rituals and bad things, but he hasn't done them yet. And so there's not really forecasting. And so instead, this is heavy-handed, leaning into something without really seeing it happen first, or signs of it happening first. So then Peter returns with Eli and Mr. Sterling, and Absalom punches him, and Eli loses it. Also, I hate that trope that the antagonist of the main character is supposed to be cool and manipulative, and then he's just losing it at the first sign of being challenged. It makes them look like bratty children, and wonder how they even got into a position of power, authority, respect, period. Absalom is just sort of allowed to attack Eli until he's pulled off and put in the wagon, and they're off to town. The betrayal of Eli really doesn't feel that strong here because we didn't get to spend much time with him. Also, a missed opportunity in Absalom not giving James the belt and seeing that look of pain on his face that he couldn't really understand, that would have led to James to ask Absalom how he felt about him. So like there were so many missed opportunities in here, but also did he really kill himself because Absalom didn't say that he loved him romantically, and then his suicide letter says that it was good enough? My assumption here is that he killed himself because Eli raped him, but I'm not even sure that all of the pieces are there for that. During the trip home, Absalom stares at the paper and zones out until magically the scene plays out in his head that shows exactly what happened to James, which was obviously Eli raping James while calling James Absalom's mother's name because, again, it's going to be heavy-handed in what happened. But I'm not sure why he had to do this. I think that we needed more development on the magical. I'm also not sure why he can zone out and have these daydreams, but that's because the magical stuff was never, it just kind of comes in when it comes in. I think that we needed more development on those magical aspects, and I also think that the magic should have come to him in the dream since we've already had that happening before. It coming as a letter is something strange since it's never happened, and we've got no reason as to why he would develop this new manner of collecting information. So as they drive, they get there, they stop to let Absalom off. Where is his dad? Why didn't he come to pick them up? They sent the bartender to go and pick him up as well as the uncle to go and bring him back. Is his dad not going to be surprised that he is coming back? Would his dad not know any of this? The fact that Willith had actually showed up to bring Absalom home is also very bizarre since Willith has a bad relationship with Absalom and he was just begging him to come home out of needing to beg him to come home. It's just also random, and I don't understand the character actions at this point. And I don't think that we were really given the pieces to justify it. Like, it feels as though the ideas are there, but only half of them made it onto the page without showing the reader the thought process of the author. And then somehow Charles Willith, after thrusting his son into the position of reverend, is surprised that his son is disrespectful of the faith, and is a literal drooling alcoholic degenerate inside of the church when that's what he was before he was in the church. Like, his son was in the gutter, and yet he is surprised that his son can't run the church. I need a reason for this because it makes no sense. He knew who his son was. He knew what his son did, and he thought his son was going to clean up when he took over the church. He couldn't really think that. And if he did, again, we need to see more of why he would stand for his son when his son is not behaving. Like, he's gonna go and insult Absalom about not being ready to take over for his dad while looking at his own son? Pick somebody else. At the very least, one of the other deacons. Quote, Willith had turned crimson at our mocking. Absalom, I am not fond of this attitude that you have developed during your absence. This must be the influence of that dead boy. Willith saying this comes out of nowhere because Willith wasn't there for the dead boy. As far as we know, Absalom didn't tell him anything about James. And so then what does this guy even freaking know about James? So again, it's another thing that we needed information about that didn't quite make it onto the page. It's weird that all it took was one semester for Absalom to get better physically, like his physical health is better, but also to know all that he needs to know in order to take over when there was all of this panic that he is so underprepared that he could never catch up, so he could never be the leader of the church. And I know part of that is the manipulation of the deacon because the deacon just wanted that role in the church. But they're all just going to accept him as being good for the church after his one semester at church school. But especially with how bad Absalom's health was before, where he couldn't, like, be around dust without freaking dying. It is so bizarre that his health just gets better and his health is never brought up again. And maybe if he did a blood ritual of some kind or the knife helped him in some way, but we didn't see that either. The entire thing of the monster creeping around the school should have also been much longer to build into this legend until Absalom finally got to the bottom of it that referenced his uncle, and then, like, maybe he killed something or thinks that he killed something, and then it ingested him, and then that's the monster that James saw inside of him that also cured his illnesses, but he didn't realize it because he somehow became this vessel to the thing by killing something else using the creature's knife. Like, there are different things that could have been done here. I just don't think that they were. Absalom then enters the church to confront Benjamin and his gang, where they are gang raping a woman on the stage. All of the pews are pushed to the sides because they basically turned the church into a frat house. There's cartoonish evilness going on. The confrontation results in Absalom cutting off Benjamin's dick in, like, the quickest interaction ever. Quote, I gave them one last warning. Benjamin, I really suggest that you leave. Even your father wishes for it. Oh, yeah? And what are you gonna do? he asked, swilling his moonshine. I lifted my blade, showing it to Benjamin. He chuckled in response, clearly not taking the threat seriously. "You're bluffing!" The tall man started, lumbering toward me, his holy poker fully on display. He had clear intent on bringing me harm, something of which I had no intentions of letting come to pass. I had suffered enough in my lifetime, I had suffered enough in this lifetime, and had no wish to leave this event as a laughingstock. In one quick motion, I slipped my blade out and sliced it across the tall man's groin, cutting off his glory. A scream shredded through the sanctuary as blood began pooling underneath him. "I have long forgotten how to bluff, Benjamin," I shouted. Eventually, he is carried out of the church, but he does not drop the moonshine. I repeat, he does not drop the moonshine. Hashtag remember what is important here. I have no idea where his dick landed. It doesn't mention anything about that. There was just, for me, there wasn't much fight in this. And the dude is just like, fine, I'll leave. But you're never going to get the stains out of the furniture. Again, I mean, whatever. His dick was cut off. There's not much fight to be had left. He probably needs to get out. But like, the fact that the entire town couldn't get this guy out of the church and needed this kid to come back from church school to cut the dick off to chase him out of the church. What? The deacons could have removed him. Dad could have removed him. Sterling could have removed him. The mobs of people that didn't want to tithe could have removed him. Guy even just stumbles out, holding his crotch. They don't even carry him out, mind you. And talking in full sentences. It doesn't work for me. Once the Goonies are all chased out of the church, Absalom asks why his dad didn't put a stop to this. Apparently, all of the women in town were also brutalized by this gang. I know it's just the church, but it's just the church. How did no one in this entire town stand up against this? It wasn't just an issue of lacking in tithing. Like, y'all allowed a gang of hooligans to rape literally all the women in town and did nothing, and Absalom had to come back from school to chase out this random jerk from the church? I don't understand. The recovery of Martha, who was the woman being assaulted on the stage when he came in, is just after she got rescued is this, quote, "A minute later, Martha came back, clad in clothing that are incredibly ill-fitting. The pants were cuffed, wrapped over themselves multiple times. Even then, they were too long. Seeing as Martha was only slightly taller than my mother, she had taken a piece of rope and used it to cinch the waist tight. The shirt poofed out awkwardly, looking more like a bedsheet than a piece of clothing. She had rolled up the sleeves in a manner similar to the pant legs. Her hair, which was medium length and brown in color, frizzed due to the stress of her assault. Thanks for saving me, Abby." She stood up on her toes and gave a peck on the cheek, then wrapped her arms around my side. What do you need our help with? There is no way that you're going to be able to clean all of this by yourself." Absalom says that he wants to work alone for a little while. However, he does tell Martha that she is very pretty. She blushes and then rushes out of the church to, give him some time alone. It's so weird considering she had just been gang raped for months, and this is how we're dealing with the fallout of all of that. Especially after Sterling just said that the women of the town were traumatized, that it would be hard to recover. So it ended up feeling like the depth of the story didn't go where it could have gone. Apparently, Martha had also been waiting to hear that from Absalom for so long because she had a crush on him. So I guess, trauma recovered. It just takes a compliment from a guy that you like to end it. if only he had said the right thing to James. I wonder if James could still be alive. Absalom wonders why his dad didn't do anything to stop any of this when his dad was such a strong, faithful man. Good question. Eventually, Sterling and Martha do return. She is sobbing all over him, informed of what happened to his friend at school, showing much more emotion for him than was just shown for her about the plights that she had been through. And Sterling is like, bro, we couldn't leave you to deal with all of this and mope around on your own, right after telling Martha that she needed to chill because he'd been through enough already that she shouldn't cry all over him. So I guess we're just gonna mock him for having his own tragedies happen to him. Followed by, quote, "He lurched forward and wrapped his arms around both Martha and me, embracing us in a hug so tight that there would be no chance of escape. Of course. Also, I have to admit that I didn't think that you'd have yourself a girly friend so quickly." A blush went across both mine and Martha's face. I tried to argue otherwise. Martha did not. Mr. Sterling gave a hearty chuckle and dropped the both of us. "Leave it to the Teendyth man to make an honest woman out of a prostitute." Martha kicked Mr. Sterling. "Wash your mouth, Jonathan. You're gonna make me hate you." just irritated by how little sense any of this makes and how shallow the interactions are. It's so soon after what just happened, and now it's just like a romantic comedy meet cute. I forgot that, Benjamin had turned this church in this town into hell on earth because he had been abusing his power and everybody kind of just let it happen. So the neighborhood starts working on fixing up the church. Absalom goes off on his own because he's processing what all has happened. He cries. Martha finds him. He tells her everything, including that Eli raped James. And she's like, wow, if I knew him, I'd probably kill him. That is referring to Eli. As if she hadn't just spent, months being gang raped by dudes that she didn't put a stop to, but she's ready to put a stop to it for James. Because of what little sense it makes, and it just feels to be overprotective for Absalom's sake, but not for the characters making sense, it made me not really care about any of the responses because they didn't feel genuine. Once Mr. Sterling finds the two of them in a closet, he teases Absalom about how, quote, it was so good that you were crying, huh? Now, I just feel like I'm 21 again, working on my first novel where my mentor was like, now you're going to need to decide if your characters are characters or if your characters are joke, because you have no character when you reduce them to trying to make snappy one-liners or jokes all the time. And that's where I was at while reading this, is it felt like character was traded to make jokes, to make lightheartedness, and maybe that's what the book was going for, but then it feels like it weakened the themes and the scariness of the book. And so then I feel like it probably shouldn't have gone into the rape direction that it went into. It maybe he could have gone away and then come back and Benjamin never was in the pulpit and they didn't have to deal with that. And then immediately Martha clicks with him anyway. And that would have, I feel like, made a lot more sense than just traumatizing Martha to then ignore it and make jokes. But it also kind of makes you wonder why this dude, they all talked about how terrible it was that Benjamin took over, but why is this dude teasing a man of the cloth that he wanted to come back to lead the church out of defilement? It just reads immature. Everything is fixed up. Everything is then fixed up. Absalom leaves, finds Benjamin already drunk in the gutter again. I guess his missing dick isn't much of a problem, wasn't much of a problem if time has passed. I'm not really sure. And I guess, I guess Absalom really helped Benjamin because you can't get whiskey dick if you don't got a dick. So there's that. Absalom decides what he wants to do with Benjamin while he's just passed out in the gutter, and so he turns him over, theoretically, so that Benjamin will choke on his own vomit and die. I think it might have just been better if he came across Benjamin dead already from bleeding out. But because, he was also drinking, so his blood was thinner, so he would have bled out faster, possibly. And so then if nobody wanted to help Benjamin because he was an asshole, and if nobody wanted to help Benjamin because of what he did to the church and the town, then it would make sense how he died, and then Absalom would still be the one to blame for that because he did not pause when cutting off the dick. Kind of made me actually think of the Dalen Kool-Aid Man situation. Anyway, the next chapter starts by saying Benjamin is found dead and it was a blessing and it made the community happy in general. Maybe they should have just killed him sooner because, there were a bunch of them and only one of Benjamin. Quote, Benjamin's death was a bit of a blessing for the community. It seemed that no one truly realized the stress that his presence had put on the townspeople, and he was the reason for many to indulge in their vices. So nobody is accountable for themselves, and it was all because of Benjamin that anybody indulged in their vices, but that also doesn't really work because Absalom and his dad helped out prostitutes and drunkards all of Absalom's life, so they have always been there. So saying, well, it's Benjamin's fault that anybody indulged in their vices and then made this town imperfect doesn't really work. And it also kind of turns it into this mystical situation where everything is just perfect and you don't have to actually work for an outcome as soon as Benjamin is dead, which also gives the book a feeling that it is not about a character accomplishing anything or about a character either growing worse or growing better. It is just trying to get to a goal, to do a denouement, to do a tableau, which has to do with the desecration of faith in this newfound religion, which is the cult that he wants to get to. And that's what it really feels like, is that the story is rushing through itself to get to show something, and it's not spending the time it needs to develop the story are the characters or the choices. And so everything is just fixed when Benjamin is dead. It's even said in the narrative that Benjamin's own mother hated him. His father obviously hated him, though his father apparently liked him before he became the leader of the church and then hated him after the leader of the church, but his character didn't really change because he was a sleazeball in the prologue, so I don't really know. And if everybody hated Willith, how did they even get into the deacon position? How did they sustain the deacon position? How did they not get voted out? And after this happens, where his son obviously destroyed the town, how does he remain a deacon instead of everybody chasing him out of deaconhood? Immediately after Benji's death, all of the trauma just lifts from the town as if nobody else was involved. You can't really do this sort of thing without magic involved, and obviously magic is involved in the story, and there is the dagger, which I wish had been utilized a bit more to show or justify this stuff. I don't imagine that it is not part of the story, but it just didn't make it onto the page in a way. And for me, it felt like the entire city had been character assassinated. Now the lechery is cleaned up since Benjamin is dead. Lechery had been around since both Benjamin and Absalom were kids, so I don't really know how Martha is suddenly no longer a prostitute because she has Absalom's attention, which then follows that none of the other prostitutes wants a prostitute anymore because they're following after Martha's lead, and they all start going to church. The men of the town doubled down on their vices at first, and they complained to Absalom about him taking all of their whores away, but then they realized that they were becoming like Benjamin and got scared straight to not act like that anymore. As if there was not a gang of dudes in the church doing the do. It was only Benjamin's influence, and it never happened before, and they were all just scared of becoming Benjamin. Let's be real. They were all scared of Absalom de-dicking them. That's really what the thing was. During this time skip where the town is cleaning up, we actually don't even get anything from Absalom's dad about why his dad didn't do anything about this situation. Benjamin's dad is obviously in mourning because he lost his son, and Absalom's dad is distant. Martha gives Absalom someone to listen to his trauma while he just kind of trauma dumps on her. Quote, "Perhaps it had been my relationship with Martha. Her and I had become increasingly close, stealing away quiet moments in the church steeple on a regular occurrence. They had started out simply as a way for her to comfort me in the trauma that I had developed. Soon enough, though, I managed to get her to share with me her plights. Having been the child of a prostitute with an unknown father left her in a position where it was nothing short of impossible for her to not follow in her mother's footsteps. Mr. Sterling had been the closest that she had had to a father figure. He was sufficient enough, but the negative influence from her mother did nothing to help give her a positive future." Where was her mother now? Why wasn't Sterling helping her? Why didn't Sterling give her a job at the bar to try to give her something else to do? We'll never know. Her mother was not shown in anything. She was just blamed for her daughter becoming a prostitute. Everyone in town then comes to church, listens to Absalom. Everything just falls into place, and he spends the next few months avoiding his father and feeling guilty about the fallout with his uncle. Why not talk to his dad about the possible rape that his uncle committed on his mother? Why not talk about the weird relationship that he had learned about? Why not talk about what dad had allowed to transpire in this town, which felt really against his father's beliefs and the type of man that Absalom thought his father was? There is so much here that could have been handled, and all you have to do is have the character actually try to approach his father, and that would create drama in and of itself. Also, as Absalom is thinking about all of this stuff, there are more dreams of James and a dead woman that we can probably assume is going to be Martha, because that is the only female character who is named and involved in this story. Willith eventually apologizes for what his son did. Absalom's mother comforts him about what has happened. Absalom gets pleasure seeing Willith be humbled and sad, and is just like, why is his mom suddenly hanging around when she was so sick that she couldn't leave the house before? So this is also something that we're going to notice. Whereas in the beginning of the book, before anything really happened, he was considered extremely sickly and couldn't leave, which is why he fell behind in his studies and shadowing of his father. But then his mother was also described as being so sickly that she couldn't keep weight on, and so she had to overeat during the summer and fall months so that she could have enough weight during winter, because she would just deteriorate. But all of a sudden, she is no longer deteriorating, and her sickness has just gone away in the same way that Absalom's sick has gone away. And I can accept Absalom's sick being related to the putrid cloud and him having the knife, but I think that it needed to be utilized more and discussed more, and then it going on to the mother just looks like it wasn't convenient anymore to have that element. Absalom is just being at home when he receives an invitation to James's funeral. How did he get it when nobody handed Peter the address? I know that Absalom had talked to James about giving an address so they could send each other letters, but how did James get this address? The reception of this leads Absalom to lose his mind at Deacon Willith when he tries to be compassionate. Quote, "It truly is difficult to lose someone close to you." Willith tried to comfort me in my grief. I let out a small sneer in response. "What?" he asked. "Deacon Willith, do you not remember how you treated me the day that James took his life?" "Yes, and I regret it every day, Absalom." "I would hope that you would, Willith. I truly am sorry. It was downright unchristlike of me to treat you in such a manner. I know that it was no excuse, but had I known how it felt sooner." His demeanor was small, physically begging me to accept his forgiveness. But it was far too late for that. The wounds of his treatment had reopened. He may have changed, but he was still the same man who stole from almost every family in town. The same man who mocked me my entire childhood. The same man who raised that moon calf of a son. There is no excuse, Charles. How is it such a foreign concept that you do not have to feel something to comfort those who do? I barked at him. I know. I was acting very poorly. I hope that one day we can... I turned to him. "And how dare you think to compare my James to that unholy bastard that was your son? If anything, something should have been done sooner about him." It felt all pent up, emotions leaving. I only wished that my uncle had been there as well. Honestly, had my uncle been present, my treatment of Willith would have been less harsh. "I know. I spared the rod, and I should not have." "Your son is burning in hell, Charles Willith." The presence was back. The damnable spirit aura that Willith had lost came rushing back. The snap behind his eyes was audible. "Absalom," he growled at me. "Yes, Charles," I replied with a smirk on my face. "You were always such a judgmental child." "I was judgmental? Because your damned brat that went out of his way to make me suffer was a paragon of unbiasedness?" I stood over him. He was so much shorter than he had been when the fat had layered his heels. "Yes, you were judgmental. Even before my son spoke to you, he had always recalled you walking up to him, directly addressing his weight. I mean, of course he was a fat bastard and he deserved it. Ah, and you still judge and refuse to listen to the point. Before he had spoken to you once, you began to harass him about his weight. I remember the exact day. Now, I will never deny that I should have disciplined him better, and his treatment of you was much worse. And how are you so sure that my harassment of him predated his behavior?" "Do you know why he began to drink?" Willith inquired. "No, nor do I care. He heard it helped those who drank to lose weight." "Well, that's rather pitiful of him, is it not? Fine. Do you think vices are only for the weak?" he yelled. "Of course." Now, I am all down for a character that has a negative arc. You need to broadcast it, though. But this is showing that Absalom has always been a bad person, because he's not even denying that this was the way that things were. So it's not even that Charles is making things up. It's that Absalom has been like this and has acted holier than thou. And it's kind of rewriting the earlier parts of the story in a way that we didn't see and in a way that was not represented in the earlier parts of the story. So it feels like at some point something changed. But then we're also supposed to believe that he is some good change in this universe where everybody is now going to church, is cleaning themselves up, but he is also being controlled by this putrid cloud. So how is it that he gets everybody going to church and quitting drinking and quitting their vices and quitting prostitution, but then at the same time, he is supposed to be like this terrible person because the putrid cloud is taking him over? Like, what is the influence of the putrid cloud? Because I don't really see how these things connect. It also is just such a bizarre, angry tangent here that almost feels personal in a way, and I don't really want to go further into that, but I don't think it makes character sense for him to freak out in the way that he did, to take this role as leadership and then be like, no, you're screwed, you can never be better than you were, unless he actually wants to do something against Willith. And this situation might imply to you that he would do something against Willith, that would be part of the climax, but this beef with Charles and the Willith family never actually comes up in the ending of the story, which actually would have made a lot more sense if he, did his ritual and then had his new disciples take out Willith and just kill him for sacrifice, like something. But especially with the earlier story about the slitting of the throat with the blade, with the kukri that was gotten, where there were piles of bodies. It would have made a lot more sense if this ended also with piles of bodies that were not necessary, but it was because of the putrid cloud. But it is also something that then speaks to a more juvenile narrative and makes it feel more YA, because again, there's no repercussions to Absalom and there's no repercussions to Deacon. It's just somebody speaking out against their bully from their childhood and going, I don't care that you're being nice right now, screw you. And it's very childish. In order to get back at Absalom, sort of in a way, the Deacon then tells Absalom that his dad frequents brothels and always has, and that's how he blackmailed the man for money all of these years. I'm going to assume that is also how he made his dad not stop the bad things in the church, but that doesn't actually come up. Absalom doesn't believe the man and says that if he's lying, then he's going to come back and kill Willith the same way that he killed his son in the alleyway, because apparently when it talked about rolling him over, that was what he did to kill him, and it wasn't from bleeding out from loss of dick. Absalom goes home angry, finds out what was said about his father was true as he talks to his mother. Then a bird hits the window while he's talking to his mother. And during this combo, Dad enters the room finally, and Absalom addresses him and says, well, your mother slept with your uncle, so fair is fair. I got to sleep with whoever I wanted to sleep with. Dad screams at Absalom how he is a possible bastard child belonging to the uncle and that Mom was way too seductive, that it was her who made Eli sleep with her. And because Mom slept with Uncle, that justified him in sleeping with other women, even though it suggested that Mom was raped and Dad is blaming her for it. Things escalate until Dad is beating Absalom on the ground. Mom grabs a hold of Dad and gets him off of Absalom and tells Absalom to go while she soothes Dad. There was also another bird that hit the window and instantly died during this conversation. I'm not entirely sure how Mom planned to soothe Dad, because it seems like Dad holds a grudge against Mom for having been raped, as he is just sitting there angry and as he is screaming about how your mother cheated on me. I don't know how she would pull it back. This also feels very contradictory with the earlier part where they were flirting like lovebirds, because he did not hold any of this coldness towards his wife earlier on, and it just feels out of the blue. Before Absalom leaves, he asks his mother if Dad ever laid his hands on her, and she just says yes, he has hit her before. There is no grace in this situation. Mom insists that he goes. He coughs blood in agreement and then leaves, goes to the church where he yells at God for being made into a modern Job. And the voice that's been talking to him all of this time isn't God. He demands that things take action against his dad and his uncle for what they have done, and the thing tells him to do it as he is breaking down. Now that makes sense for something that is evil, an evil god, a putrid cloud, whatever. But then if this is where he is accepting the putrid cloud's help because he feels like God has betrayed him, then all of those things before shouldn't have happened until he accepted the putrid cloud, or until the putrid cloud kind of showed him, hey, look, I'll help you out where God is not helping you out. So you should become my disciple, because look at what I can do for you, will do for you while you are being neglected, while you are being ignored. So while he is having a breakdown, Martha comes in and sees his state, says that she'll kill his dad for him. Martha is just freaking beast, apparently, because she's like, I will kill anybody except the people that were abusing me. But Absalom says that he wants to do it. Then they spend the night together. Next morning, randomly, Peter arrives and picks Absalom up for the funeral. He packs and the two of them leave. He gets there, realizes that it must be weird for Peter to see him giddy as he's thinking about killing his dad and uncle on the way to this funeral. Somehow, James's entire family knows about Absalom, and now I'm just kind of confused about how much time was spent at school, because I thought that they were departing for the end of the first semester or the first term, the first year, but apparently they had heard about him so much that they feel like they've been waiting all of this time to meet him. Maybe it was through letters, but again, it was another implication that I think this book needed more time to express the relationship, to show the relationship, so that it wasn't jarring and just like, oh, and all of a sudden here they are. It feels like this was something that came up during writing the draft, and then since it feels like a first draft to me, it was never revised earlier on to include this business earlier on and expand upon it. I've met way too many people that think a first draft is good enough, and not for me, no. You also have Dad spanking Mom as he tells her to go and do something else, and she pouts and giggles. And this is a funeral. Quote, Sarah, lay off the poor boy. He's just got here. Can't I be excited to be able to meet him finally? I heard so much about him. No, you can't, he growled. Fine, she pouted in an over-exaggerated manner. Now get. James's father gave a swift slap on the rear end as he said it. His wife, giving a yelp, did not seem entirely adverse to his actions. She quickly scuttled off. Damn, I love that woman, he said under his breath. Again, it lacked emotional depth because, like, one, why are you acting like this in front of this? Two, we're gonna find out really that none of them liked James, and they didn't even believe that James could change. They sent James away because James was possibly gay, or he looked gay, or he acted gay, because he had affections for the son of a deacon. And they all thought that he was doomed, and they're going to be at the funeral and saying that he is damned to hell, but they're all like, I am so happy to finally meet the boy that I believe corrupted my son. Because that's also what they call Absalom later, is they believe that he is the one that did this to their son. So you'd think that, one, they would be colder. Two, they wouldn't invite him to the freaking funeral unless they were going to be dicks, which also could have been a very good tension building thing, which is that he was already given that letter, possibly by Peter, because Peter is possibly a better person. So Peter would invite Absalom, and then everybody at this place would just be so cold to Absalom that would then later influence his actions that are going to come up after the funeral. But like, this could have been made so weird and so like almost The Hills Have Eyes, like very creepy-esque, with them watching him, with nobody being warm to him, with the vibes of the funeral being off, and the putrid cloud whispering to him about what he needs to do. Look at him. Yeah, you doing a good job? Absalom is then talking to James's dad, and he learns that James's family is Anglican. For me, that begged the question of, wouldn't they have a difference in schooling? They wouldn't just send James to a Protestant school, which is what Absalom says. He is Protestant, and so if your specific sect of religion is different, wouldn't you go to a school that would teach that specific sect? Because others are often seen as heretics or not sharing the same values. Specifically, in the mid-1800s, would you not think that you would go specifically to a Pentecostal or Anglican, I think it's Anglican, school? Because it matters a lot, these little differences between people. Also, we learned that a cow is going to be giving birth today and is right next to the graveyard where they will be having James's funeral. So you're going to have a funeral and a cow birth. Absalom is relieved that after only a year, his asthma is better because he can make all these physical treks better. The fact that he got better so quickly makes the entire childhood of being sick kind of pointless and wrong, and clearly he should have been forced out of the house to do more physical labor in order to get better. Again, this would have been better if you saw him more making the pact with the putrid cloud, and in making the pact with the putrid cloud, he actually was given better health, and so then you would see him get more and more obsessed in helping or doing things for the putrid cloud because he would see immediate action back. Like, it all makes sense, but I don't feel like it came onto the page that way. Like, I can see the crumbs of these things in the story, but I don't think that it actually put them in the story. He trauma dumps on them during the funeral, kisses the casket, and then goes to the barn for the birth. I don't know why we need to be shown this cow giving birth to a stillborn, but there's that, and he complains about why can't things be better. The time passes while he's there, and he doesn't feel like he's being treated with hospitality. The food is gross. He's not given a blanket to sleep under when he's sleeping. He is put with the children when he is eating. Absalom also keeps zoning out on people's faces, and they just keep changing. And the putrid cloud, whatever it is, he finally accepts it here. The birth of the stillborn cow could have also been another opportunity for the putrid cloud to show its power and tell Absalom, hey, if you touch that cow, I will endow you with the powers to bring it back, as a show of my solidarity of how I can help you if you help me. And so then he could have done the miracle of bringing the cow back to life and being seduced by this evil spirit. But the dead cow feels like something that was there to sort of hint at something putrid being around, in the same way that, like, during the fight with his dad, there were the random birds that hit the window and immediately died. but that never really comes back, and it's not really used, and it's not really talked about in anything to give an example of like what it's connected to, what it means, what the imagery is of. So it just feels like it's vaguely connected to the putrid cloud or to be creepy, but it doesn't actually build lore. We don't get much on the putrid cloud in general, which kind of doesn't help if that's what we're supposed to be seeing him seek refuge in with all of these bad things. He gives in to the putrid cloud to care about him, and he says, oh yeah, he doesn't care about being evil, but he does care about not being seen as himself. So that's all that really matters at the end. The funeral comes the next day, and everyone is just dunking on James being in hell because of his deviancies, and there is no way that he escaped hell because of his deviancies. And of course, he ended up seducing men when he was sent off to seminary. Oh no, all of the people's faces are changing. Here you would have thought that perhaps, I mean, I know that he committed suicide, but perhaps his family might have been like, I mean, I know that he committed suicide, but after a year in seminary or 2 years in seminary, however long he was there to try to fix himself, maybe he committed suicide as an act to try to stop himself from his sins, to spare himself from sinning further. And so then he may be in heaven because he tried to stop himself from his deviancies. Like, there were other ways that they could have taken this, but the fact that, and especially if they wanted to act like they liked James at the beginning of this, and then at the end of it, they're just like, yeah, he's in hell, burn in hell, bitch. There was no change for him, and he was always doomed. Okay, so then why did we play pretend at the beginning before we even went to the funeral? And so it ends up feeling like it was just trying to be creepy or trying to be rude in a specific way, but it doesn't build into the characters. It doesn't make sense for the way that they acted when Absalom first got to the funeral with James. During the funeral, everybody is in a merry mood, and Absalom hates them all, everyone sucks, and you get this quote. Peter's evil was born from something more intelligent, more conniving, watching his face twist into utter despair to the same false grin that his father used was nothing short of terrifying. It was not just another dark trait coming to the surface of his person. This was the betrayal of himself. This was a different Peter than the jovial man that I sat and shared gossip with in the late hours of the night. I had a strange feeling that this was not a new facet of Peter. Suddenly, I finally processed the information that had been given to me. Now, we know that the putrid cloud is messing with the way that Absalom sees other people. So if all of this is actually just the putrid cloud twisting what these people are actually saying, what they actually look like, I mean, we know that it's changing what they look like. But if the putrid cloud is actually turning Absalom on these people, then that could also be a way to go, where he is not seeing good as good or people who are good as good because the putrid cloud is messing with his perception. But that was also not really written in here. Absalom is saying that he doesn't care if he's evil and he is dreaming about killing all of these people because he thinks he is justified in killing these people. I don't really know who his character is supposed to be at this point because I don't think that his actions have shown his beliefs or a character, and the story is just kind of going wherever it wants to go. Suddenly, the language also felt very modern in talking about Peter being the one to out his brother to his family. The dude wants to be mad about how everyone is being disrespectful at the funeral, and he's over here like, meh, wanting to kill everybody. Okay, dude. Everyone gets hungry, so they go back for food, and everyone nibbles on mediocre beef. The bro is complaining about no one being respectful, and they can't even respect that he is being provided for food. He has to judge the food at a funeral. Quote, during the time, I decided to fully embrace the Eludi family. As awful as they had treated James, both before and after his death, I could not fault them. Honestly, to mourn properly may have been past their mental and emotional capacity. Instead of secluding myself, I made sure that I would interact with the family as much as possible. I made conversation with the men of the house, all save Peter and the Right Reverend. They seemed fairly content in each other's company. I assisted the women with their food preparation as they prepared for the larger meal of the night. I made a fool of myself, crawling around the floor and tussling with the young children in the family. I made myself loved out of nothing but spite. I had learned how to be likable in the few months that I had been leading Afton Assembly, and I exerted that experience here. We didn't actually see him do that, by the way. It just said that everything kind of fell into place. we didn't see him at all becoming charming, which also sucks because, again, influence. Show the influence. This entire thing is about influence and evil and giving into the evil and the different ways that it feels like he is being stalked by evil to the point that it disorients him in what he is viewing, but we don't actually see it happen. The Aludi family's strict adherence to the roles that they were given made it easier to discern that the women were in the kitchen cooking while the men sat around under the guise of watching the children. Even more so, none of the men in the family seemed to be the type that would go out of their way to fully interact with their children. As the time continued, the Aludi's family opinion of me shifted. They no longer saw me as a mentally ill man who led their little boy astray. Instead, I was now something just less than a son to them. It was somewhat easy for them to accept me when I alluded to not returning James's feelings. That was a partially true fact, but they did not need to know the complexities. So, number one, the dudes see the kitchen as women's work, but they don't think less of Absalom for helping in the kitchen. Number two, it sounds like he is both contemptive of the children, because he's like, I crawled around and made a fool of myself, playing with the kids, but also he's judging the dads for not being more involved with the kids and only pretending to watch the kids. And also he's going to murder all of the kids because he thinks that they're just as bad as the rest. So I need you to be consistent about this. If you're going to do something, try to fit in, because he would, at least if he was with the men doing what the men are doing, nobody would think lesser of him for not being in the kitchen. So again, it makes you go, what is the logic behind all of this? Instead, it ends up feeling like a shoot off of the nice guy TM energy. The entire section just ended up making him feel insufferable as a character, which is a real bummer when I liked him in the initial reading of what his character might have been. Then you get this quote, "The Right Reverend folded hands and led the group out in prayer. It was pompous and meaningless as every other word he uttered about God. Mrs. Aludi had again proved that some people simply could not provide a good meal, as the table spread was nothing more than sludges of various shades of gray. Despite going on 2 days' worth of time with no sustenance, I refrained from putting the horrid mix near my mouth. I forced myself to accept that they were no lesser a person due to their inability to cook. That did not mean that there was not a myriad of other things that made them lesser. Everyone present choked down the mess, pretending that it was the most delicious meal that they had ever been served. For all I knew, it was. After everyone had cleared their plates, the men retired to the back room to smoke, as the women lounged amongst themselves. So I guess, one, they're not doing dishes, but two, look, I can read into this even as, because he's given into the putrid cloud, normal food doesn't look good anymore, because he's going to partake in cannibalism here in a second. Spoiler alert. And obviously his sense of reality is distorting because he doesn't see these people as who they're supposed to be. Their faces keep changing. So I can see all of that involved. But also he's just a pompous jerk in this. He's a judgmental jerk, and he's saying all of these people suck, but he also actually sucks. And he can be a narcissistic asshole. But why do I want to see him be doing anything and being self-righteous in what he thinks he's doing? The thing with this type of character and this type of character arc is you have to make them interesting and consistent in having their own moral code and showing that interesting side of them when they are a bad person. And I just don't see it here. I don't see him losing to that corruption. I just see him thinking that he is better than everybody, and then it's a long line of thinking that he is better than everybody. He thought that he was better than everybody in town. He specifically thought that he was better than the Willits, because obviously they're thieves, and so even when they try to repent, it's never going to be good enough. He thinks that he's better than these people. He's better than Quill and beat the crap out of Quill at school. He's better than his classmates, and he always defied what other people were doing. And so I don't really see his difference in character here. It is just he is being more openly contemptuous than he was before. One of the men asks him if he wants to go out for a smoke and offers him a lighter to walk away with. Absalom doesn't have any smokes, and the guy doesn't have any extra smoke, so Absalom takes the lighter and says that he's going to go get his smokes from somewhere. Where, I'm not entirely sure, because it's not like they're in the car. There is no car. He goes out of the house, blocks up all of the windows, puts a fire around the house, and then lights it all up with everyone inside, men, women, and children. He stares into the window as they beg for him to let him out. I don't know why they don't go to the opposite sides of the building to try to get out, because apparently there is only one exit, one window. I don't really know. I don't know how effectively he covered everything, but it just says that nobody gets out. It happens so rapidly and so randomly, and he's going to judge these people for not taking proper care of the children, but then also he's just going to murder all of the children. So again, it's another area where he needed to be consistent, but he's condemning them for the mistreatment of the children, and then he too does it. And he doesn't even have a moment of, what have I done? Or, well, those kids were the spawn of these people, and so clearly they were going to be doomed to follow in the footsteps of those people, so the earth is better off without them. Like, you needed something to show his mindset on this, and it's not there. To add to the everybody sucketh, after burning the house down and killing everyone, no one stopped him. There'd be no punishment, there's no fear, and also he goes to James's grave, and he finds out that they buried him in a very shallow grave that would have left it for animals to smell and dig him up to consume him, and how rude that was. Absalom picks up James's body and brings it back to the family home that is now a pyre of bodies and burnt wood that somehow nobody escaped from, period, in the hours it took for the entire thing to burn down. I'll accept demonic magic was used to trap the house and make the flames go up faster, but that is still lame, and it wasn't actually said in the text or implied in the text in any way, and it needed to be there to show the power of the putrid cloud. At the house, he thinks about how hungry he is, and the demonic voice in his head tells him to eat what is in front of him. He tells him that he can't and that there is nothing to eat, and the voice insists that he consume the bodies, specifically the bodies of children. Why? Because it just feels like it's trying to be the most transgressive that it can, but not for the point of the story, just to be like, this is worse than eating the men or the women. Quote, the more I ate, the more vigorous I became. It began to finally dawn on me the fullness of being ascended past mankind. It did not simply mean that I could take lives if I felt just, but meant that I could take even without the excuse of justice. I did not need to act within the responsibilities and moralities of man. Concepts such as ethos were beneath me. I could eat as I wished, judge as I wished, and love as I wished. So again, that would have been something good to show when he was watching the flames burn, and he could have even had a moment of his own moral panic as he's looking at this family through the window of fire that is being held shut by dark magic, as the putrid cloud is holding these things closed because these are sacrifices for the putrid cloud. And you could have Absalom being like, oh my gosh, there are people in there who didn't even do anything. I know that some of them were evil, like the dad and James, but some of them really didn't do anything. And what have I done? And then you let this happen. You have the putrid cloud talking to him, assuring him that he did the right thing. And then you have this where he then eats people and he goes, you know what? You're right. I have ascended. I don't need a reason to judge people. I don't even have to judge people. They can just suffer because what I do is correct. And you have assured me that what I do is righteous. And so then that would show the shifting of his mindset and the corruption of his mindset because of the putrid cloud, if that is what it was trying to do. But that, again, feels like something that was heavily skipped in this. So he is really feeling himself as he is smacking his lips, eating the fatty family, and says good thing that they were all fat because it means more meat for him. Meanwhile, you do have him hitting a character moment, or what I felt was a character moment. Quote, for the first time in my existence, I felt in control. The lungs that betrayed me so often when I was younger could be fully filled. My main tormentor had been removed from existence by my own hand. I was on the path to ensuring those who were pure, those who I cherished, were never threatened again. I was born into this world less than human, raised to be the second to every other thing. But for once, I was not only first, I was above. And so again, this could have been a stronger moment if, one, his illnesses hadn't just disappeared from him climbing stairs and doing pranks with James. But here we are. Once he is done eating, he puts James in the carriage in which he came and they head home. He doesn't recognize anyone as he goes. Their faces constantly changing. And as he's traveling, he thinks about how the God of his childhood was a lie and this putrid cloud is the true one that loves him. Quote, I thought back to what it said to me all those nights ago, the insinuation that the cloud and the God that I served as a child were one and the same had become asinine to me. The God of my childhood had made me far too powerless for me to think that they were one and the same. The God of my childhood, or at least what I was told was him, was a being that expected me to accept the abuse and let him handle the judgment made on others. Under the glory of the cloud, I was allowed the right of defense and protection. Under my new God, I was given the right of my true nature, and the difference did not end there. I could not reconcile that I was so very neglected under something that told me to trust it, yet now that I was allowed to do as I wished, I was never left to myself. So again, it's something that we could have seen change over time while he was in school, with the putrid cloud trying to get a hold on him when he was there, especially after he got that kukri, because that was the changing moment, in my opinion. But we don't actually get to see it grow. And so you could actually have had him be, one, punished by Mr. Quill and then have to take it because, you know, the God that he was raised with said, turn the other cheek, take what you got to do. And then later, when Quill shows up and just starts beating the crap out of James, he can be in his own head arguing about what he is supposed to do, what he was brought up to do. And the putrid cloud being like, nah, that's a lie. You know how to get what you want? You should be defending yourself. You should be defending him. You should take your knife to him and just freaking do it. And then that gets him all of this respect because he listened to the cloud. And so it looks like he's being rewarded for defending himself, for defying the things that he was brought up to believe. And it can show that duality and that temptation. And when he starts slowly trusting the words of the putrid cloud more and more until he's like, you know what? God was a lie. The God of my childhood was a complete fucking lie. But we don't see that. Oh, another part of that could have been as he gives into that putrid cloud, then he feels bad and he apologizes, prays to the God of his childhood. And it eventually results in not defending James, or in apologizing to Quill, or, you know, showing that what feels like weakness. That would then also lead to James killing himself because he turned the other cheek and he did what he was told that he should do. And that actually just left with James killing himself because of the choices and the things that he followed that he felt like he had to believe because of the traditional God that he followed. And then that would give him another reason to turn on the God of his childhood and just show, look, this one is for me, this one is not for me. He says the most love that he had ever felt was with James and the cloud, so I guess Martha was just a placeholder for James until James could come back. I will not be surprised if this book sacrifices Martha to bring back James. He gets inside and is greeted by this figure that turns out to be James and is in the church. How he didn't recognize James's voice, I'm not entirely sure, but he's also obviously not entirely all in his head. Quote, I am so sorry that I have refused to let you love me by the way that you wished, I said in his ear. Whatever do you mean? He replied. You always wanted me physically, yet I never let you have me fully. A fragrant scent floated my nostrils, a safe and familiar scent. It's very strange to have somebody apologize for you not wanting to have a sexual relationship with them because you didn't want to have a sexual relationship with them. Like, it's not disrespectful to not want to sleep with somebody. But, you know, hot take, apparently. The two of them go off to have sex, though he hates every second of it, but he just doesn't feel like he can deny James his body. And he thinks about what his uncle did to James again, so yet another instance of thinking about family or a family member while having sex. Can't stop seeing it everywhere. Guys, it is Nazis, incest, or vampires. You see one of those in almost everything. Then I'm getting whiplash as he is holding James and calling him his beloved James, and the next morning, immediately he shies away from him. Meanwhile, Easter morning is on its way. It's just a couple days away, and he is going to be giving his first Easter seminar, leading the church for a major holiday. Absalom goes to Mr. Sterling to see if the regulars will be at the Easter sermon, and of course they will. Then he returns home. Willith and Uncle Eli are there, and Mom tells him that he should come back later and not interrupt the meeting the two of them are having, but he does. He invites his uncle and dad to the sermon, saying that he has had a change of heart at the funeral because of how poorly James's family spoke of him. He said that his family hated him for being Protestant when they are Anglican, that they were the ones to send him off to the school, which was clearly Protestant. It doesn't really make sense to send him to a Protestant school if you hate him for being Anglican. I mean, we know that they hated him for being gay, but did they hate him for being Anglican/Protestant? Did they hate him for being Protestant, and would sending him to a school of a different denomination not make it worse? They eventually agree to come to church the next day as Absalom promises to change himself for the better. He spends the rest of the day bothering people to make sure that they all show up to church the next day, and it feels really stupid. Why do you need to go door to door in a small religious town to ask if people are going to come to church on Easter Sunday? That is like one of the few days where even the people who are only socially religious or vaguely religious still show up because it is a very strong religious holiday. Back at church, Absalom asks James if he'll attend this service the next day and play a part. I'm confused as to how we didn't have anything to actually bring James back to life. He just came back to church with Abs, and Absalom doesn't have any questions for how he is there in the state that he is in. Maybe the putrid cloud possessed him or something, but like, We've got nothing about this. It just is there. And it feels like something did not make it to the book from the author's head that would have made it make sense. The dude won't say what he wants James to do at the sermon, just to be around. He doesn't want to freak James out about what is going to happen, and he's planning to get retribution on everybody who had ever harmed him. He is getting retribution on this entire town and not just his uncle and his dad, who are the ones that wronged him. Why are we suddenly genociding this entire town when he literally just saved it from its depravity and everybody listens to him anyway? And also, what happened to Martha? It's funny that she just disappeared. It'll make sense later, though. But, not a surprise. It does just feel like the book doesn't care about the female characters, though. Absalom is circling in his head about how much retribution he is about to seek for James. None of these people even hurt James. None of these people knew James. Your retribution was sought when you murdered James's entire extended family. So what did these people have to do with James? Eli is the last one that you should have anything to have to do about James, and he obviously is not even seeking retribution for what Eli did to his mother. He only cares about what Eli did to freaking James. Again, showing how the female characters in the story don't matter. What they go through doesn't matter, and Absalom doesn't care about them. Everyone then gathers for the Easter Sunday sermon. He positions James in a hiding place behind the pulpit, and he gets started, first talking about how he went to James's funeral. He talks about the differences in the Anglican religion burial and how he was raised to believe that they were serving God, but do they really know who they are serving? His father is a liar, after all. He draws his sacrificial knife while talking about the new God that told him that he had never heard of before. From the pulpit, Absalom says he blessed the town by killing Benjamin, and everyone is doing much better without him, and it's the right of the gods to do what he did. The crowd applauds him, though Benji's dad is like, I was right. You are a bad person. And James feels betrayed and slaps Absalom across the face. Absalom loses himself and smacks James back even harder. Somehow, James knows who Benjamin even was, though they'd never met. And this is going to make sense later because James is actually Martha and he is only seeing James in Martha. I don't know what happened to James's body because it never really mentions anything happening to James's body. He's just imagining Martha as James. Absalom tells his uncle to bring Martha, who is the living James, the sacrifice to the altar. We knew that was going to happen. He then eats both Martha and James on the altar. I don't know why he was seeing Martha or how he was seeing Martha as James when the body of James was also there somewhere, because they're both at the altar, which means he put James's corpse behind the altar and Martha was out there. So he had two Jameses in his field of vision, but he wasn't recognizing either. And that feels like it was an attempt to do like a plot twist, but it doesn't make any logical sense for what James would be seeing, and that James wouldn't question that there were two of those unless he at least acknowledged and then dismissed that there were two, because that's how you can show the sort of insanity and the normalization of his insanity. So James kills Martha, eats Martha and James on the altar until they are both gone to the point of nothingness. The congregation is then filled with pouring doves from the sky and whatever that means. And then he turns to this feeling of love that he feels and asks what the name of that feeling of love coming from the sky is. And it says, "We are Chaush, praise the putrid cloud." And that is the end of the book. Some of my final notes here at the end is I'm convinced that this was a first draft, and I do find it disrespectful. There are things that can get through accidentally, especially typos or plot errors, and you may not think of everything when you are working on a plot and you've gone through it a million times, and you're not necessarily going to be able to control for how other people read your story. But because of the different things that just sort of fall out, where it also just feels more like an outline than a developed story that allowed the characters to get to know each other, it ends up feeling like a first draft that was possibly edited, but it was not revised. And a revision is a full, brick by brick remake, and editing is just like line editing at best. I would like your best analysis of what you think the elements of this book represent or mean. The author of this book does have a degree in theology, and so I personally feel some religious trauma in here, maybe some betrayal from the church that he has experienced. I know I have experienced some betrayal from the church, but I don't think that I necessarily take it this far to go devil worshiping. But we all deal with things differently. You'll probably see you'll see some more variation in stuff with the Westies, since in general, with it being America in 1880s, everybody is pretty casually religious. I also found it's interesting tidbit. I also found somewhere on Reddit where the author said, quote, Absalom isn't as insane as one might think, which begs the question, what does this book mean to imply if Absalom is correct in what he ends up doing and how he treats others? Is he supposed to be a hero? Is he supposed to be a worshipping of a Joker style character where it's just destruction of the institution? Is he not supposed to be seen as somebody insane who demonized everybody around him at the influence of a demonic cloud? Like, that kind of becomes the problem when you go, you can have somebody who is insane or who is a bad person, who is possibly correct, who does say correct things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be considered not as insane or not wrong. So does this believe that Absalom is in his right mind doing what he is doing? That is the question. I would love to know your thoughts on it. Now, I was not expecting this to feel like YA, but it does feel like YA, and I think part of that, and I know that there is so much, I've talked about it before on the channel, there is so much going around of like, well, what does it mean to sound like YA? Why is that used as an insult? Because the content, and it's not meant to be an insult, but it is a simplified way of telling a story. And I think part of that is the narrative style, not specifically it being at a school. Also, it reads maybe like dark academia for a part of it. But what makes it feel YA is the main character is always correct. The other people that are against them are always wrong. James is immediately his friend because he is the good guy. So what you usually see in YA style writing is we are the goods, you are the bad. It is very clear from the start. And if you don't like the main character, then you are clearly going to be part of the bads. And rather than YA writing, it is just kind of immature writing. Now, it's very disappointing that this went the way that it did because I liked Absalom at the start and I had hope and I had faith in this, in being a story of this character that does have a realization, an opening, an exposure to other things, and may or may not give in to the forces of evil around him. But as it went further, he obviously became insanely judgmental, insanely self-righteous so fast. And not only was it because of the Putrid Cloud's influence, but it looked like the Putrid Cloud's influence just made him more open about how judgmental he had always been. The other thing that makes me feel like this was a first draft was that the prose were questionable, and there were issues in it that made me think, was this even edited? A lot of repetition and a lot of telling language that read unnatural. This is also something that would read as YA, is that you need to tell the reader intentions because you don't trust the reader to catch on to what you're saying, and then it just feels dumbed down. And I'm like, why am I an adult being talked down to? Quote, I was astounded by its beauty. What am I looking at, uncle? I have never seen anything like it, yet I can tell that this is the most beautiful version of whatever it is. It's a knife, Ab. Well, I assumed that, but what is it? Where did you acquire this? Are you sure you want to know? It is highly likely that you will cause your uncle to go on a fairly large rant about his passions. It was clear that he was being cheeky. He knew that I wanted to know. He just wanted me to beg for the details. I rolled my eyes. Yes, uncle, I am absolutely sure. Another. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as it beat hard inside of my chest. I felt myself begin to weep. My horrors had not been unfounded. Another. I cocked my head, curious to know more. Eli began to explain. There was also something that it was like, he leaned forward, I wanted to know more as well, and so it's kind of like, I understand what the body language means, I don't need it to be repeated. You had a lot of things where it would do the clutching of the chest as I something my chest, where you have the repeating of the same word in immediately the same sentence or in the connected sentence, the dependent clause. Another. It was easy to tell at one point that this building was fairly ornamental, though years of failed cleaning caused all of the wood in the building to be coated in a thick layer of dust. It was clear that the area had been neglected. We didn't need that extra sentence. We already recognized that it was neglected. Years of failed cleaning and coated in layers of dust. That is the implication. Another. Shh, I'm here. I knew that you feared the dark, but I did not know that it was as bad, he said as he tried to comfort me. I shook my head, no, trying to convey that it was much more than a fear of the dark that frightened me. He did nothing but try to comfort me. We stayed in the dark until my sobs stifled and I could regain my composure. Even then, we stayed silent for another moment. James then broke the silence. I am so sorry for letting you out of my sight. I truly did not know that your affliction was this bad. It was not just the dark, James, I huffed. the air still not fully occupying my lungs. So it could have removed the he doesn't know that it is more than the dark that scares me from the thing before, from the paragraph before, and then just introduced it later naturally in the dialogue. Also, the repetition of silence, 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 silence. The flow could have been much better. Also, what is this line? Immediately charged forward to retaliate, screaming more profanities than a man of God never should. Than a man of God never should? Profanities that a man of God never should. I think it means ever should. Then you also have this, like, see, I'm getting to some little tiny things, but it was very consistent. So I'm just trying to give you examples of where the editing looks like it failed. And the final one that I'm sharing is, quote, chatting with my fellow coworkers. Coworkers implies that they are fellows, so you don't need fellow coworkers, it's redundant. I don't normally focus on the editing issues unless it happens a lot to the point that it makes me pause. And so when this kept happening, I constantly had to stop and just like breathe and But so that kind of gives you an example of what I'm paying attention to when I talk about editing and prose. This book feels like it should have been longer. I don't necessarily know how long it needed to be, but it felt like it wanted to be over and it was rushing to get somewhere and skipping around so much just to get there rather than exploring the interesting and meaningful elements that it had placed. I wish that we had gotten to see much more of the relationship grow between Absalom and James, Absalom and Martha, Absalom and Eli, Eli and James, so that we could actually have power between the events that happened between them all. In my opinion, making everyone the worst of the worst and everything work out for the main character is also a sign of immature writing. You can definitely do it in ways that show that the main character is narcissistic, egotistical, has a god complex, has this magical power on their side that just makes everything go along with them. And so then you can do sort of monkey's paw to show the bad side of that, to show the insanity, or to show the delusion that they think everything is on their side, but it's really not. However, I don't feel like that was done here. Everyone else, what really felt like it was is that Absalom was always righteous in everything that he did, and everyone else was always the worst of the worst, and those who weren't bad fawned over him, while everyone else who was bad-coded by the downright hatred they had of him and their lack of subtlety in their behavior, including when Eli just flew off the handle to yell at Absalom when Absalom questioned him. You don't need to do that, especially not with a character that is in a position of power. No one pretended to have manners, no one pretended anything at all, and that's what makes the narrative read very immature. Additionally, interesting how it feels like it takes James's sexual assault via his uncle much more seriously than the sexual assaults done by others to Martha, to the women, to his mother. While it does demonize the dad for cheating on the mother and implying that Eli had raped the mother, and mom had no choice due to the time period, but it didn't pair well with the way that the women had been abused at the church when Benjamin was in charge, and then it immediately allowed Martha to completely fix herself. She was just better. Mom was dismissed, and then James killed himself after he was raped by Eli. So it kind of shows a difference in how it was handling rape, and that rape by women was just sort of it's just something that women go through, but it's a serious issue when it happens to a man. That's at least how it felt like to me. And the women were just all treated like secondary, so whatever. Ultimately, this story felt like it had something that it wanted to do, and that's more of what it focused on. The accomplishing and not the getting to the accomplishment. So the actions all felt empty. The relationship between the uncle the relationship of the uncle to this needed more. How the uncle was mad needed more, when it really looked like it was grooming because he gave the kid the knife, and none of these events were connected to build up to the final moment where Absalom is ascended to being a disciple of the putrid cloud. And deciding himself to be a god. Was that not something that Eli felt? Eli also should have been talking about, hey, you should listen to that voice. You should be a part of this. Like, what was the point of the uncle giving him that knife? And did he try to get rid of the spirit from following himself? But also, Eli was just a bad man in general. So it doesn't really make sense why he gave the knife, why Eli wasn't also a disciple, why Eli and Absalom didn't have a different relationship when Absalom became ascended and was like, I understand where you're coming from, uncle. So you didn't really have these connections to justify how these people interacted or what even Eli's goal was in giving him the knife. It was just an event to make a thing happen and again made it empty. Overall, I was just disappointed in this book when I went in pretty hopeful and looking forward to it. With that said, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Have you read this book? Will you read this book? Give me your best analysis of the elements. With all that said, have a great week, have a great weekend, and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Way. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?